Good day. In this video I'll be showing you how you can create an app in Laravel. So we will create a sample app so that you can learn how to do things in Laravel. But first, let's take a look at this devdocs.io. This is a documentation site which has offline features. So if you do not have internet connection, you can still access this. So if you try to go to the offline, and we can select documentation that we want to use while we are offline. So let's try Laravel. So click on install, and now it's done installing. So we should now be able to access the Laravel documentation while we are offline. So I'll try to disconnect. Okay, so now I'm disconnected from the network. So if I try to access Google, I should see this and I can play. Okay, so now we should be able to access Laravel while we are still offline. So first we need to figure out how to install. So click on Laravel and then installation. Okay, so this is my preferred installation style, so I'll just copy that and open a new terminal here and paste it. Okay, so I have currently no network, that's why it's telling me that. So I'll just try to connect now. Okay, and let's retry. So this should take a while, so I'll just pause the video. Okay, so now it's done installing. So it's now installed in this directory, Laravel. So what I need to do now is to go inside this directory and then move everything out of the public folder. So cut and then paste. So now we can edit the index.php file, and since we move it out of the public directory, we should now remove this, because this means it's going to go out of the public directory and into the bootstrap folder. But since index.php is now relative to the bootstrap folder, you no longer need to do this. So remove it, as well as this. Okay, so that's it. Now we can serve the page. So first, we're inside the www directory, so we need to go inside the Laravel, cd Laravel, and now I can create a server. So if I access this URL, I should now be able to see the default Laravel homepage. So as you can see, there's none, so this means we have to open a new terminal here and then make this writable. So sudo chmod -r777 storage. Okay, so now should now be able to see Okay, so there's still none. So need to edit the .env file. So it's up debug is equal to true, which means there should be an error, but there's none. So it's saying that there's an error here. Invalid requests, unexpected EOF. So index.php failed opening, required public index.php. Okay. So it's still reading from this directory, but since we have already moved it, we need to edit the configuration. So what we need to do is to open the server.php file, because this is what's this php artisan serve that we've used here. It's using this file, so it's gonna serve the public index.php file, but since we already moved it outside of the public directory, we should remove the public. Okay, so now we are getting the correct output. So what we do now is to create a database. So sample, and then create a users table. ID, email, and then password. So email is varchar, let's say 300, and then ID should always be a primary index, primary key. So go, and then should be auto increment. So save. Now we have users table under the sample database. So let's edit the .env file and place in the DB database should be sample. Then username is root. Then password is secret. Okay. So now let's create a let's just drag this in. Okay. So we have to create a new view. So views are stored under resources, views, and then create a new file. So let's just say login, so that the user can log in. And then let's also create a folder under the views. So this should be layouts. So this is where we're going to install the layouts that's going to be used by other pages. So let's just say default. So this is going to contain the HTML document structure. So instead of this, we need to yield a title section. So this section, title section, is going to be defined on the child, which is login. So login page is going to inherit from the default layout. So let's just create a wrapper, and then inside the wrapper we're going to output the contents of the login page. So content. So now from the login page, in order for this page to inherit the HTML from this template, you need to use @extends and then specify the name. So since it is stored under the layouts, we should say layouts dot. So we use dot instead of /. So dot and then the name of the file, so default. So we have to omit the .blade.php. So now we can define the two sections that we have outputted here, so title and then content. So to define a section, use the @section and then title. Then here will be the title of the page, so login page, and then @stop to end the section. And then the other section will be the main content, so @stop and now we're going to use a framework so that you no longer need to write some CSS code for styling. So I'm going to use the skeleton framework, which I can also get from CDN.js. So skeleton. So this is the CSS file, so copy, then paste. Now we can copy this, so copy, and then where we are going to install this should be in the public directory. So public, and then we need to organize our files. So we have CSS folders and JS. So if you have images, you can also create img. Okay, so we're going to install it inside the CSS folder. So new file, and then skeleton.min.css, and paste in what we've got from here. Okay, so now let's go back to the default layout and link it. So to link CSS files, you always need to output it and then call the asset function. But if you're working on HTTP URL, you need to use the secure asset so that it would generate a HTTP URL. Because if the current scheme of the page is HTTPs and you're linking in a file which isn't loaded with HTTPs, you would get an error. So asset, and where is this installed? So we have installed it under the public CSS. So asset is always going to start in the public directory, so we don't need to include that. So we're going to say CSS and then skeleton.min. CSS skeleton.min.css. Okay, so now let's copy some code. So forms. Let's just copy this so we no longer need to write anything. So this should go in here. And since we only need email and password to log in, we just copy this and then remove everything else. So email and then password. So this should have a type of password. Then remove the placeholder text. ID should be password. This should be email. And inputs should always have a name. So name, email, and then name, password. So instead of submit, login. Okay, so now we should create a controller which will call this view. So controllers are stored under app HTTP controllers. So create a file here. So home controller.php. So it's a convention that you should always use controller for the name. So inside this we should specify the namespace. So where is it installed? So app and then HTTP controllers. So for namespace, it's a convention that you should always start with capital letters. So here you can see that the letter is small, but we should turn it into big. HTTP controllers. Okay. And now we should use the base controller. So it's stored under illuminate routing controller. So if you check the vendor directory, you should be able to see it. So vendor and then Laravel framework source illuminate. So every class under Laravel is stored under the illuminate namespace. So routing, so this one, and then controller. So this is the class where we are inheriting the basic controller logic. So we don't need to think about this, but it's important to know where things are stored. So now we have to provide an alias so that we don't need to refer to it as this, but instead this. So now we can create our controller. So class, and then what's the name of the controller? Home controller. Extends base controller. Now we can create the function that will display the login page. So return view and then the name of the view, so login. So the view function already knows that views is stored under the resources views, so you don't need to include the path to that. So all you need to do is add the file name if it is not stored under a folder. So if you check resources, you can already see the login view. So all we need to do is place in login. So the next step would be to edit the routes file, so we can assign a page for this function to be executed. So app HTTP and routes. So instead of returning the welcome view, you need to delete this and then use the home controller instead. So home controller at what function? Login. So if you access the home page, this should get executed. Okay, so this is now the login page. So as you can see, it doesn't look right. So let's link another CSS file. So link, and then this should be the main CSS file of our app. So under the CSS directory, we create style.css, and then the wrapper should only be 800 pixels, and it should be centered. Oops, so it still doesn't look right. Okay, so it's 6 columns. We need to change this to 12 so that it will consume the entire width. Okay, so now we can add a form method which should be post and then the action. This is the route where you're going to submit. So first let's create one. So go back to the routes and then route post and then the name of the route. So login, home controller at do login. So now we should define this function under the home controller. Public function do login. Then we need to capture what's inputted by the user. So in plain PHP, you would usually do $_post and then the name attribute. So you can still do that. Let's try. So return, then you have email. So let's just verify. Yes, it's email. And now we should change the action. So login. So it's going to post to the login route. That's why we use post in here instead of get. So let's try. Login. Okay. So we're going to get a token mismatch exception. This is because we need to add a hidden field for every form. So input type is equal to hidden, and then the name should be _token. The value should be whatever is returned by the CSRF token function. Okay, so if we view the page source, you should be able to see the token that was generated. So this token is used for preventing cross-site request forgery. So so just read on that. But it's important to remember that you should always include this in every form so that you won't get the CSRF token error. So log in and we should be able to see the email. Okay. But since we're inside Laravel, we need to do things the Laravel way. So first you need to use another class. So this time it's illuminate HTTP and then request. So now we could inject this class into the login and refer to it as request or rec. And then instead of $_post, we can get the input by using the rec variable and then calling the input method and then the name of the field. So save email. So if we refresh this, we should still be able to see the same thing. Okay. So now we're going to need to store it to a variable, email, and then the password. So rec input password. So we said here that we need to capture the user input, but first we need to validate. So the user should not be able to log in if he hasn't inputted anything in here. So in order to validate, you need to use the validator class. So use validator. Okay. So now we need to create a validator. So first we need to inject this into the do login function. So validator and then validator. So now let's create a new validator. Validator is equal to, oops, I guess we no longer need this, so let's just refer to it directly. So validator make, and then this will take two arguments. First is the input. So calling the all method in the request should return all the inputs. So the next is an array which contains the validation rules. So email should be required and it should be an email. Password should be required. Now we need to check if the validator has failed. If validator fails, we need to return to the home page and then pass the errors. So with errors, and then which errors we need to pass is the validator errors. So just pass in validator, and then we also need to pass in the old user input. So with input, okay, so now in the login page, okay, so first let's just return OK. So this should be executed if the validation is okay. So if the validator failed, then simply redirect back to the home page. And once we've redirected to the home page, the user should be able to see the same login page. So here we can capture the error that we are passing in here. So we can check that by using the errors variable. So if errors and then any, we should output an error box. So div alert, then it should be a danger alert. So in our CSS file, we can now style this accordingly. So style.css and then alert danger, background color red. So now we can loop through all the errors. So errors all to return all the errors, and then as error. So this error variable should now store the current error. Okay, so we're just going to output it inside an li. So we should add the UL as well. Okay, so let's try submitting this. Then we now got the error. So if we input something in here, we should just get the password field required. Okay, so now to get the previous inputted value by the user, you need to add a value attribute and then call the old function, and this should simply take the name attribute value, so email. For the password, we do not need that because, you know. So if we try again, this should be retained even if we got an error. Okay, so now we need to add a login function. But first, we do not have any users yet, so we're going to create a temporary function for adding a user into the table. So test add, and then let's just pass in a function for now. And then we need to use the database class. So db table and then users, insert, so email should be my email, and password, we should call the bcrypt function to encrypt the password. So secret would be the password, but it's not going to be stored in the database. Instead, the hash will be stored so that the hackers cannot have access to the actual user password if they have compromised the database. So we simply return OK, and then we can now access the add page. So add. Okay, so access denied. So let's check DB database. It seems it's using the homestead, but we do not have homestead in here. Okay, so I've resolved the issue. It seems that we don't really need to include the USDB, so we can just use it directly inside the route. So if we add that, we should still be able to see the error. Oops. Okay, so it's messing with me. So we got the error there, but you should be able to insert new rows without the USDB. So if we check, there's now the users. So let's truncate this for now, and then insert. Okay, so now we could log in with these credentials. So in order to log in, we need to go back to the home controller, and now we can proceed with the login. So in order to log in, we need to use the auth class. So use auth, and then you can now use it here. So if auth, and then call the attempt method. So this attempt method accepts the login credentials, so the email and the password. Okay, so if this method returns true, it means that the user has been created. So the session for the user has been created if this returns true. So the one thing to remember here is that it's going to use the users table by default. So if you have another table name for the users, you should change it to users. And this is also a convention, email and then password. So now we should return OK for now if it has been redirected, and then failed if not. So let's try. So we're secret login. Okay, so it's returning OK. Which means that the user has been created, login. So we need to check the dev docs so that we can know or verify if the user has really been logged in. So auth, it's not this. If I remember correctly, there's the auth check. Authentication. Okay. Authentication. Then let's look for the method for checking the current user information. So I guess we can use this. So from our routes, we can just remove this now and then return the current user. So when logging in, if this returns to true, it automatically creates the user session, which means that it saves the user information into the session. So here we're simply accessing it. So if we access add, we should be able to get the user information for the current user. Okay, so this is the currently logged in user. So if we try to access its email, we can do that. Okay, and I think there's an auth check method as well. So auth check, so if the check method returns true, it means that the user is logged in. If not, the user is not logged in. So you should be able to see this. Okay, but now if we try to access another browser, we should be able to see this. So there's currently no user that's logged in, so that should be the proper output. Okay, so user is not logged in. So now what we do here is to redirect to the admin page. So redirect and then admin. And if the login has failed, we simply redirect back to the home page and say something like a message. So you could also pass in custom messages using the with function. So the message is the name that you're giving to the custom message, and then here you can set the type and the actual text. So incorrect user email or password. So now we should access this from inside our view. So now we're inside the login view, and you can just include it below. So if session message and if, so inside we need to create another alert. So alert and then the type. So session message dot type. So it's simply accessing the items in the array that we have specified. So we can access type and we can also access text. So now we can add another type in here, for example success, and should be green. This means that we can also pass in success in here, and we can effectively alter the styling of the alert. So this should now contain alert danger, and then inside we simply access the actual text. So let's try that. So let's try another email and then password. So this should return an error, incorrect email or password. But it seems that it's not working because we haven't added the alert and then the dash. So if you try it again, you should now be able to see the difference. So for example, I pass in success in here, it should be colored green instead. Okay, let's just bring that back. So now let's go back in here. So we're redirecting to the admin page. So let's create that now. Drop and then get admin. So we should be able to create another controller, because this controller is now for login users only. So index, and let's copy this and then create another controller. And then remove the functions and rename the controller class, so admin, and then add the index method. So this should now return the index page under the admin folder. So to create that, we need to go to the resources, views, and then new folder, admin, and then inside is index.blade.php. So let's just pass in a title, and then you can add it as the second argument. So title admin page. Okay, so let's try logging in with the correct credentials. Okay, so now we have this admin page. But now the problem is, if you copy this and then access it from the browser where a user isn't logged in, you should still be able to see it. So we need some way to add a validation or check that the user has logged in order to access this page. So in order to implement that, we need to use a middleware. So middlewares are used for listening for specific routes. So if a specific route is accessed, the middleware is going to be executed, which we can then add the code for checking if the user is logged in. Okay, so to create a middleware, you need to go to the app, HTTP, and then middleware folder. So currently there are 4 default ones, but we're just going to create a new one to simplify things. So check login.php, and this should be a class, so check login, and then it should be under the app, HTTP, and then middleware. And from here we need to use the auth class and the closure. So we've already seen auth earlier, so this allows us to check if a user is logged in. So this closure class is basically used for listening to specific routes. So you can get access to the current requests by using the closure class. So every middleware should have a handle method. So public function handle. So this method will execute the code for checking if user is logged in. So the handle method automatically has the current request passed into it, and then the second argument would be the closure. So let's just refer to it as next. So now we can check here if the user is logged in. So if you can see that we have added the exclamation mark to negate the result of this. So if the user is logged in, and then if the user is logged in, it means this will return to true, and then we negate it, so it becomes false. So this specific code will be executed if a user is not logged in. So what do? We just return to the home page with a message that the user needs to log in. So type danger text, you need to log in, moron. Okay, just kidding. So now if this doesn't get executed, we should simply return the request. So this means that the current request will be transferred back to the controller. So if you have this function in the admin controller, this would get executed. So that's the meaning of this. Return the control back to the controller. So now we can't still use this. We need first to register this specific middleware. So you can register it under the app http and then kernel.php file. So here you can see the middlewares that are executed on every request, and these are for the routes middleware. So we should add our file in here. So the key would be user that is logged in. So you can name this any way you want. So you can actually say is login, and then the path to where the middleware is. So let's just copy this, since all the middlewares are stored in this folder. And then what's the name of our class? So check login, and then access the class. So now that we've already added an alias to this check login middleware, we can now use this from our routes. So let's just copy this and then go to the routes.php file. So where do we need to add this specific middleware? So we need to add this in the admin route, because this shouldn't be able to be accessed by users who are not logged in. So to add the middleware, simply call the middleware method and then pass in an array. This would contain the middleware that you want to execute. So now if we access this, this is the browser where the user is logged in. So if you refresh, we should be able to see the same page. Okay, but now we're going to access the browser where we do not have it. So enter. As you can see, we got redirected back to the login page, saying that the user needs to log in. Okay, so now what you can do is to use a route group and then add the middleware in there. So middleware and then the name of the middleware. So route group takes the array containing the options for this route group, and then the second argument will be the callback function, which contains the routes that are related to each other. So instead of doing this, we can now remove it, and we can add other admin pages in here. So create user, and now if these are accessed, the isLogin middleware will now be executed. So using route group just prevents you from duplicating code. Okay, I guess that's it for this video.